The morning sun crept over the rooftops of Pine Ridge Estates, bathing the manicured lawns in golden light. Dr. Andrew Thompson finished the last stretch of his morning run, slowing to catch his breath near the entrance of what many locals called the nice part of town. Sweat glistened on his forehead as he checked his watch. 7:15 a.m., right on schedule. He had enough time to shower and get to the hospital for his 9 a.m. rounds. Andrew had moved to this neighborhood just 3 weeks ago. After years of hard work, night shifts, and student loans, he had finally bought his dream home. A modest but beautiful 2-story brick house on Oakwood Drive. The neighbors hadn't exactly rolled out the welcome wagon, but Andrew wasn't too bothered. People were busy with their own lives, he figured. As he walked to cool down, Andrew noticed a for sale sign in front of a colonial-style house with a wraparound porch. It reminded him of his childhood home back in Georgia. He pulled out his phone to snap a quick picture, thinking his mom would get a kick out of seeing it. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" The sharp voice made Andrew turn. A middle-aged woman with highlighted blonde hair stood on her lawn across the street, gardening gloves still on her hands, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Just taking a picture of that house," Andrew explained with a friendly smile. "It looks like my family home." The woman, who would later be known throughout the neighborhood as Mrs. Wilson from number 42, crossed her arms. "I've never seen you around here before. Are you with a real estate company?" "No, ma'am. I live on Oakwood. Moved in a few weeks ago." Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "You live here? In Pine Ridge?" The way she said it made Andrew's stomach tighten. He recognized that tone. The mix of surprise and doubt that followed him into upscale stores, fine restaurants, and apparently his own neighborhood. "Yes, I do," he said, keeping his voice level. "The blue house with white shutters, just 3 blocks down." Mrs. Wilson stepped closer, her gardening forgotten. That house sold for almost $700,000. Andrew took a deep breath. He didn't owe this stranger an explanation, but years of similar encounters had taught him that sometimes the path of least resistance was just to answer, "Yes, that's the one." "And what exactly do you do that lets you afford that?" she pressed, pulling out her phone from her pocket. "I'm a cardiologist at Memorial Hospital." Andrew pointed to the hospital logo on his running shirt, which was now damp with sweat. Mrs. Wilson's face hardened. "Right, and I'm the Queen of England. Young men like you don't just move into this neighborhood. Now, I've been watching you circle these streets for days." Andrew felt his heart rate picking up again, but not from exercise. "Ma'am, I was just jogging. I do it every morning before work." "Jogging? Or checking which houses are empty during the day?" Mrs. Wilson had fully taken out her phone now and was holding it up, clearly recording him. People were starting to peek through their blinds. An older man getting his newspaper stared openly. A woman ushering her kids into a minivan paused to watch. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Andrew said, raising his hands slightly in a calming gesture. "I'm just heading home now." "No, you wait right there." Mrs. Wilson had dialed a number. "I'm calling the police. Let them sort this out." Andrew's mind raced through his options. Walking away might make him look guilty. Staying meant enduring more of this humiliation. And the police? That brought its own set of worries. 911, what's your emergency? The voice was loud enough that Andrew could hear it from where he stood. "There's a suspicious man in our neighborhood," Mrs. Wilson said, her eyes never leaving Andrew. "He's been circling houses, taking pictures. I think he's casing homes for a break-in." Andrew closed his eyes briefly. This was supposed to be a normal Tuesday morning. Hospital rounds, patient consultations, maybe coffee with his colleague. Instead, he was standing in his running clothes, being treated like a criminal, less than half a mile from his own front door. He had no idea that in less than 15 minutes, the woman now smirking at him, as she described his threatening behavior to the police, would be desperately begging for his help. Dr. Andrew stood on the sidewalk, his running clothes sticking to his skin in the morning heat. The woman, Mrs. Wilson, was still on the phone, her voice getting louder with each word. "Yes, he's right here, taking pictures of houses," she said into her phone, never taking her eyes off Andrew. "He's wearing a blue shirt and black shorts. He claims he lives here, but I've never seen him before." Andrew's mind raced. He'd dealt with prejudice before, the security guards who followed him in stores, the patients who requested another doctor when he walked into the room, but this felt different. This was happening in front of what was supposed to be his home. "Ma'am," he tried again, keeping his voice calm and level. "I really do live at 427 Oakwood. I moved in 3 weeks ago. I'm a doctor at Memorial Hospital." But Mrs. Wilson wasn't listening. She had started walking down her driveway, still on the phone with the police. A small crowd had begun to gather. A man walking his dog had stopped to stare, and 2 women who had been power walking were now watching from across the street. "He says he's a doctor," Mrs. Wilson said with a mocking laugh. "I don't think so. He's been circling the neighborhood for days." That was technically true. Andra had jogged through the neighborhood every morning since moving in. It was how he stayed in shape for his long hospital shifts. Mrs. Wilson moved closer, her phone raised not just to her ear now, but also to record Andra. "The police are on their way. They want me to keep an eye on you until they get here." Andra's chest tightened. He thought about walking away, heading straight home, but he knew what that might look like to the police when they arrived. A man fleeing the scene. And running? That would be even worse. So he stood his ground, though he felt a bead of sweat roll down his back that had nothing to do with his morning exercise. "I'm going to stay right here," he said, trying to keep the anger from his voice. "But I'd like to call my lawyer." That wasn't entirely true. Andra didn't have a personal lawyer on speed dial, but he did know the hospital's legal counsel. Still, mentioning a lawyer seemed to make Mrs. Wilson hesitate for just a moment. The hesitation didn't last long. "Oh, now you're threatening me," she said loudly, clearly playing to the growing audience of neighbors. "He's threatening me," she repeated into her phone. "I didn't threaten anyone," Andra said, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "I simply said I'd like to call my lawyer because I'm being harassed for jogging in my own neighborhood." He pulled out his phone and pretended to dial, though his hands were shaking slightly. He was angry, embarrassed, and, though he hated to admit it, a little scared. Police interactions could go wrong so quickly. In the distance, he heard sirens. His heart sank. An older man with a newspaper tucked under his arm approached slowly. "What's going on here?" Before Andra could answer, Mrs. Wilson jumped in. This man was taking pictures of houses. "I caught him red-handed." The older man looked at Andra, then back at Mrs. Wilson, and that's a crime. Mrs. Wilson's face reddened. "It is when he's obviously not from here." The older man frowned. "And how do you know that?" Before she could answer, 2 police cars pulled up, lights flashing. 4 officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters as they surveyed the scene. "That's him," Mrs. Wilson said immediately, pointing at Andra. "I caught him photographing houses." The officers approached, their faces unreadable. "Sir, we got a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood," one of them said. "Can I see some ID?" Andra reached slowly for his wallet, his movements deliberate. "My ID is in here. I'm going to take it out now." The officer nodded. Andra pulled out his driver's license. "My name is Dr. Andra Thompson. I live at 427 Oakwood Drive, just 3 blocks from here. I was out for my morning jog when this woman began following me and recording me." The officer took the license and examined it. His eyebrows raised slightly when he saw the address. "I understand there was a property for sale that reminded me of my childhood home, so I took a picture of it." Andra continued, his professional doctor's voice taking over, the same calm tone he used when delivering difficult news to patients. "Then this woman accused me of casing houses. He could have stolen that ID," Mrs. Wilson cut in, though she now looked less certain. One of the other officers turned to her. "Ma'am, do you have any actual evidence that this man was doing anything illegal?" Mrs. Wilson's mouth opened, then closed. The growing crowd watched in silence. The taller officer handed Andra's license back to him. "This checks out, sir. The address matches this neighborhood." A small wave of relief washed over Andra, but the tension in the air remained thick. Mrs. Wilson wasn't backing down. "Well, that doesn't mean anything," she insisted, her voice slightly higher than before. "He could have just moved in. We don't know anything about him." The older officer sighed, removing his hat and wiping his brow in the morning heat. "Ma'am, that's exactly what he's been telling you. He just moved in." 3 weeks ago, to be exact, Andra added quietly. Mrs. Wilson crossed her arms. Well, I didn't get any notice about new neighbors, especially not. She stopped herself, but everyone knew what she had almost said. One of the younger officers stepped forward. He had been studying Andrew's face with a puzzled expression. Wait a minute, Dr. Thompson. From Memorial Hospital? Andrew nodded, surprised. Yes, that's right. The young officer's face broke into a smile. I thought you looked familiar. You treated my dad last year. Heart attack. You put in 2 stents. Officer Daniels, right? How's your father doing? Andrew asked, remembering the worried son who had paced the waiting room all night. He's doing great, Doc. Back to fishing and driving my mom crazy. The officer turned to his colleagues. This man is one of the best cardiologists in the state. Saved my dad's life. The atmosphere shifted. The other officers relaxed their postures, and some of the neighbors began to murmur among themselves. Mrs. Wilson's mouth tightened into a thin line. Well, I didn't know that, she said defensively. He was taking pictures of houses. Anyone would be suspicious. The older officer turned to her. Ma'am, taking photos in public isn't a crime. Dr. Thompson has explained he was just admiring a house similar to his childhood home. There's no law against that. But he could have been. There's no evidence of any criminal activity, the officer cut her off firmly. Now we've responded to your call, we've checked IDs, and everything is in order. I think we're done here. Mrs. Wilson's face flushed red. So you're just going to let him go? Just like that? Let him go, the older officer repeated with raised eyebrows. Ma'am, he's not being detained. He was never being detained. He was just going about his day when you called us. Andrew stood silently, his hands at his sides. This wasn't his first experience with racism, and sadly he knew it wouldn't be his last. But having it play out so publicly in front of his new neighbors stung in a different way. The small crowd that had gathered was starting to disperse, but not before giving Mrs. Wilson disapproving looks. The older man with the newspaper shook his head as he walked away. I think I'll be heading home now, Andrew said, his voice steady despite the anger and hurt swelling inside him. Of course, Dr. Thompson, Officer Daniels said respectfully. Sorry about the confusion. As Andrew turned to leave, Mrs. Wilson called after him, her voice slightly less confident. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. You can't blame me for being careful. Andrew paused, considering whether to respond. Part of him wanted to walk away, to not give her another second of his time. But another part of him, the part that had faced these situations before, knew that silence wouldn't change anything. He turned back, meeting her eyes directly. I'm a homeowner here, just like you. I work hard, I pay taxes, and I save lives for a living. The only difference between us is that you saw the color of my skin and decided I didn't belong. His voice was calm but firm. I hope you'll think about that the next time you see someone who looks like me in this neighborhood. Mrs. Wilson opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. The officers who had been watching the exchange nodded slightly at Andrew's words. Even they couldn't argue with the truth of what he'd said. Andrew turned and began walking in the direction of his house, his shoulders straight despite the heavy weight of the morning's events. He checked his watch. He would still make it to the hospital for his rounds, though he'd have to skip breakfast. Behind him, the police were preparing to leave, their radios crackling with static. None of them knew that those radios would soon crackle again with an emergency call that would bring them all back together in a way no one could have expected. Andrew had just stepped out of the shower when his phone buzzed on the bathroom counter. He glanced at it, a text from the hospital asking if he could come in early. A busy day was about to get busier. 20 minutes later, freshly dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt with his doctor's coat folded over his arm, Andrew backed his car out of the driveway. The morning's ugly incident was still replaying in his mind as he drove through the neighborhood. He turned up the radio, hoping the news would distract him. As he approached the intersection near the community entrance, he noticed flashing lights ahead. An ambulance and one of the same police cars from earlier were parked in front of a familiar house, Mrs. Wilson's. Andrew slowed down, curiosity mixing with an instinct he couldn't quite suppress. As a doctor, he was drawn to emergencies, trained to help. But after what had happened earlier, He saw Officer Daniels standing by the patrol car, talking into his radio. The young officer looked up as Andrew's car approached and waved him down with an urgent gesture. Andrew pulled over, rolling down his window. "Everything okay?" "Doc, thank goodness," Officer Daniels said, relief washing over his face. "We've got a medical emergency and the ambulance is still 7 minutes out. The fire department's tied up with a multi-car accident on the highway." "What's happening?" Andrew asked, his doctor's mind already shifting into gear. "Male, mid-60s, chest pain, trouble breathing. Collapsed about 5 minutes ago. His wife says he has a history of heart problems." The wife. A chill ran down Andrew's spine. He knew exactly whose house this was. "That's Mrs. Wilson's husband." Officer Daniels nodded grimly. "She's pretty hysterical. When I saw you driving by, well, I know it's a lot to ask after this morning, but—" Andrew was already putting his car in park and grabbing his doctor's coat. "Where is he?" "Living room." "Through the front door, to the right." Andrew jogged up the driveway, medical instincts taking over. As he reached the porch, he could hear sobbing from inside. He knocked once, then opened the door. "Medical help," he called out, stepping inside. The scene in the living room froze him for a split second. A gray-haired man lay on the floor, his face ashen and glistening with sweat. Kneeling beside him, still in her gardening clothes from earlier, was Mrs. Wilson. When she looked up and saw Andrew, her eyes widened in shock. "You," she whispered. "I'm a cardiologist," Andrew said simply, already moving forward. "May I?" She nodded mutely, moving aside as Andrew knelt by her husband. "Sir, I'm Dr. Thompson. I'm going to help you." Andrew loosened the man's collar and checked his pulse. Weak and irregular. The man's breathing was labored, his lips taking on a bluish tint. "Classic signs of a heart attack," Andrew muttered. "How long has he been like this?" Mrs. Wilson seemed unable to speak, staring at Andrew with an expression he couldn't read. "Ma'am," Andrew said more firmly, "I need to know how long he's been experiencing symptoms." She blinked, snapping back to the present crisis. He said his arm was hurting after breakfast. Maybe 30 minutes? Then he just fell. Andrew nodded, his hands moving efficiently as he positioned the man more comfortably and checked his vitals again. "Do you have any aspirin in the house?" he asked. Mrs. Wilson nodded. "Get it now. And water." As she rushed to the kitchen, Andrew spoke to the semi-conscious man. "Sir, I'm going to help you. The ambulance is on its way. Just try to stay calm and breathe as normally as you can." Mrs. Wilson returned with a bottle of aspirin and a glass of water. Her hands were shaking so badly that water sloshed over the sides. "He needs to chew this," Andrew said, taking a tablet from the bottle. "It helps thin the blood." He helped the older man take the aspirin, then checked his pulse again. Outside, he could hear the distant wail of an ambulance siren. "They're almost here," he told both of them, his voice calm and steady, the same voice he used with all his patients in crisis. Mrs. Wilson stood frozen behind him, watching his every move. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. The man she had tried to have arrested was now fighting to save her husband's life. But there would be time for that realization later. Right now, all that mattered was keeping Mr. Wilson alive until the ambulance arrived. The ambulance pulled up with a screech of tires. Through the window, Andrew could see 2 paramedics jumping out, grabbing their equipment. "They're here," he told Mr. Wilson, who was struggling to stay conscious. "Just hang on." The front door burst open as the paramedics rushed in, their faces focused and professional. One was a young woman with her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, the other an older man with salt and pepper hair. "What do we have, Doc?" the female paramedic asked, immediately recognizing Andrew's clinical demeanor. Male, mid-60s, showing all the classic signs of a myocardial infarction, Andrew reported, switching to medical terminology. "Began with arm pain approximately 30 minutes ago. Pulse is weak and irregular, breathing labored, skin clammy. I gave him aspirin about 3 minutes ago." The paramedics nodded, setting down their equipment and quickly taking over. The older paramedic pulled out an oxygen mask while his partner prepared an EKG machine. "We need to get him to the hospital right away," the female paramedic said after checking the EKG readings, definitely showing signs of a heart attack. They worked quickly to stabilize Mr. Wilson and prepare him for transport. Andra stepped back, giving them room to work, but stayed close enough to assist if needed. Mrs. Wilson stood in the corner of the room, her earlier hostility replaced by naked fear. She looked small and vulnerable now, nothing like the confident woman who had confronted Andra hours ago. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andra moved to her side. Despite everything that had happened, he couldn't help but feel sympathy for her. He'd seen this fear in hundreds of family members before. "They're going to take him to Memorial Hospital," he said gently. "That's where I work. They have an excellent cardiac unit." Mrs. Wilson looked at him, her eyes red and puffy. Would you go with him?" The request surprised Andra. After the way she had treated him, the last thing he expected was for her to want his help. But he understood the desperation behind her words. When someone you love is in danger, pride goes out the window. "I'll follow the ambulance in my car," he promised. "And I'll make sure the cardiac team is ready when we arrive." As the paramedics loaded Mr. Wilson onto the stretcher, Andrew pulled out his phone and dialed the hospital. "This is Dr. Thompson. I need to speak to Dr. Chen in cardiology immediately." He waited a moment, then continued, "We have an incoming heart attack patient, approximately 5 minutes out. Male, mid-60s, history of cardiac issues. I'm with him now and will be following the ambulance." The paramedics wheeled Mr. Wilson toward the door. He reached out weakly, grasping his wife's hand as they passed. "It'll be okay," he whispered, though his face was twisted with pain. Mrs. Wilson squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I love you," she said. "Please don't leave me." The raw emotion in her voice touched something in Andra. In that moment, she wasn't the woman who had profiled him and called the police. She was just a frightened wife about to face the possibility of losing her husband. "Ma'am," Andra said, "do you want to ride in the ambulance or follow in your car?" She looked uncertain. I don't think I can drive right now." Andra made a quick decision. "You can ride with them. I'll drive behind you." As the paramedics loaded Mr. Wilson into the ambulance, Mrs. Wilson turned to Andra. "Thank you," she said, the words catching in her throat. "After this morning, you didn't have to stop. You could have just driven by." Andra met her gaze steadily. "That's not who I am." For a brief moment, shame flashed across her face. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, then closed it and hurried to the ambulance. Andrew watched as they helped her climb in beside her husband. Then he jogged back to his car, his mind already shifting to what would need to be done at the hospital. He knew the next hour would be critical for Mr. Wilson's survival. As he pulled out behind the ambulance, sirens wailing in front of him, Andrew couldn't help but marvel at the strange turn the day had taken. This morning he had been treated like a criminal. Now he was racing to the hospital to help save the life of his accused's husband. Life had a strange way of bringing people together sometimes. The emergency room doors slid open as the paramedics rushed Mr. Wilson inside on the stretcher. Andrew followed close behind, his doctor's coat now properly on, his mind fully in professional mode. Taking him straight to cardiac room 2, called out a nurse at the front desk as they wheeled past. Andrew nodded, already pulling on a pair of gloves from a nearby dispenser. The hospital corridors were familiar territory to him. This was his world, where his expertise and authority were never questioned. Mrs. Wilson hurried alongside the stretcher, her face pale with worry. A nurse gently took her arm. "Ma'am, you'll need to wait outside while we work." But Mrs. Wilson began to protest. "I promised we'll update you as soon as we can," Andrew told her firmly but kindly. "Every minute counts right now." Mrs. Wilson reluctantly allowed herself to be led to the waiting area, looking back over her shoulder as her husband disappeared through the swinging doors. Inside cardiac room 2, the team moved with practiced efficiency. Dr. Chen, the head of cardiology, was already there, examining the EKG readouts from the ambulance. "Good to see you, Andrew," Dr. Chen said without looking up. "I wasn't expecting you for another hour." "Change of plans," Andrew replied, moving to the side of the bed. "What are we looking at?" "Classic STENI," Dr. Chen said, referring to a particular type of heart attack. "We need to get him to the cath lab right away for an angioplasty." Andrew checked Mr. Wilson's vitals on the monitor. Pressures dropping. We don't have much time." The next 30 minutes were a blur of activity. The cardiac team worked together seamlessly, each person knowing their role. Andrew assisted Dr. Chen as they threaded a tiny balloon through Mr. Wilson's arteries to the blockage in his heart. "There it is," Dr. Chen murmured, pointing to the monitor showing the blocked artery. 90% occlusion, no wonder he collapsed. Carefully, they inflated the balloon, pushing the blockage aside, then placed a stent to keep the artery open. Almost immediately, the monitors showed improved blood flow to Mr. Wilson's heart. "Nice work," Dr. Chen said as they finished. "Another few minutes and we might have lost him." Andrew removed his surgical mask, feeling the familiar mix of relief and exhaustion that came after a successful procedure. "He'll need close monitoring for the next 48 hours, but I think he's going to pull through. You want to talk to the wife, or should I?" Dr. Chen asked. Andrew hesitated. This wasn't just any patient's family member. This was the woman who, just hours ago, had treated him like a criminal in his own neighborhood. But that seemed like a lifetime ago now. "I'll do it," he said. In the waiting room, Mrs. Wilson sat alone, her hands clutching a paper cup of untouched coffee. When she saw Andrew approach, she stood up so quickly she almost spilled the coffee. "How is he?" she asked, her voice catching. "He's stable," Andrew said, gesturing for her to sit back down as he took the seat opposite her. "We'd found a severe blockage in one of his main coronary arteries. We've placed a stent to keep it open, and he's responding well." Mrs. Wilson closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging with relief. "So he's going to be okay." "The next 48 hours are critical," Andrew explained. "But yes, I believe he's going to recover. He was very lucky." "Lucky," Mrs. Wilson repeated, opening her eyes to look at him. If the blockage had been complete, or if there had been a longer delay in treatment. Andrew let the sentence hang, not needing to finish it. The implication wasn't lost on Mrs. Wilson. If Andrew hadn't been driving by when the emergency happened, if he hadn't stopped to help despite how she treated him earlier, if he hadn't been able to recognize the signs of a heart attack and act quickly. "You saved his life," she whispered. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The whole team did. "But if you hadn't been there, at our house," Mrs. Wilson's voice traveled off. She looked down at her hands. "This morning When can I see him?" Andrew asked, deliberately changing the subject. He wasn't ready for her apology yet, if that's what she was trying to offer. 2 days later, Andrew was checking his patient notes when his pager beeped. He glanced down and saw it was from the cardiac floor, Mr. Wilson's room. He finished his notes and took the elevator up, wondering what to expect. Mr. Wilson had been recovering well, his vitals improving steadily. There shouldn't be any medical emergency. When Andrew reached the room, he paused outside the door, hearing voices inside. He knocked lightly, then entered. Mr. Wilson was sitting up in bed, looking remarkably better than he had 2 days ago. His color had returned, and though he still had IV lines and monitoring equipment attached, the worst was clearly behind him. Mrs. Wilson sat in a chair beside the bed. She straightened when Andrew walked in, smoothing her skirt nervously. "Dr. Thompson," Mr. Wilson said, his voice stronger than Andrew expected. "My wife told me everything that happened, both before and after I collapsed." Andrew nodded but said nothing. He moved to check the monitors, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I wanted to see you," Mr. Wilson continued, "because I need to thank you personally, not just for saving my life, but for doing it after the way my wife treated you." Andrew finished checking the vitals and made a note on the chart. "You're welcome. Your numbers are looking good today. How's the pain level?" "Better," Mr. Wilson said. "But that's not why I asked you to come." Andrew finally met the older man's eyes, seeing the genuine emotion there. "My wife and I have been talking a lot," Mr. Wilson said, reaching for his wife's hand. "About what happened that morning. About why she reacted the way she did." Mrs. Wilson looked down, her face flushed with shame. "I don't know if you can understand this," Mr. Wilson continued, "but we grew up in a different time, with different ideas. That doesn't excuse what happened, but—" "I was wrong," Mrs. Wilson said suddenly, cutting off her husband. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I was completely wrong about you, and not just because you're a doctor or because you saved my husband. I was wrong to look at you and see anything other than my neighbor." Andrew stood at the foot of the bed, his clipboard held against his chest like a shield. He'd heard apologies before. Sometimes they were sincere, sometimes they were just to make the person apologizing feel better about themselves. When I saw you taking pictures, I didn't think there's a new neighbor admiring a house, Mrs. Wilson continued. I thought, well, you know what I thought. And there's no excuse for that. Mr. Wilson squeezed his wife's hand. We've been talking about how to do better. How to actually be better people, not just seem like better people. Andrew finally spoke. I appreciate that. But this isn't about making me feel better. It's about recognizing that snap judgments based on skin color can have real consequences. Like my husband nearly dying because the doctor who could save him was almost arrested for jogging while black, Mrs. Wilson said, a slight tremble in her voice. Andrew nodded. Exactly like that. There was a moment of silence in the room. Outside in the hallway, a nurse wheeled a medication cart past the door. The steady beep of the heart monitor continued its reassuring rhythm. I can't promise I'll never make a mistake again, Mrs. Wilson said finally. But I can promise I'll try to catch myself, to question my own assumptions. That's a start, Andrew said. Mr. Wilson looked at his wife, then back at Andrew. Would you consider, once I'm out of here, would you come over for dinner sometime? As our neighbor, we'd like to know you better. The request surprised Andrew. He studied both their faces, looking for any sign of insincerity. What he saw instead was hope, regret, and a genuine desire to make amends. I'd like that, he said finally. But fair warning, I'm a terrible cook. So it's probably better that you're doing the inviting. The tension in the room broke as Mr. Wilson chuckled. I make a pretty decent grilled salmon, once they let me near a stove again. As Andrew prepared to leave, Mrs. Wilson stood up. Dr. Thompson, Andrew, thank you. Not just for saving his life, but for giving us a chance to be better people. Andrew nodded, a small smile finally crossing his face. Everyone deserves a second chance. Even racist Karens who call the cops on their neighbors. Mrs. Wilson winced, but there was a hint of a smile on her face too. I guess I deserved that. You did, Andrew agreed. But hopefully next time I go jogging, you'll just wave hello instead.